I'm really delighted to be here today with Dr. Jim Field, who is a cardiologist and has been regular in this little corner, especially talking with Paul Vanderklay about such things as philosophy and art and drama. And we connected at the Chino conference on the quest for a spiritual home. And we thought it would be fun to have a conversation. So Jim has mentioned that he's very interested in the work of Matt Siegel. And we thought we might talk about that a bit, and then we might also talk about the Chino conference. So, Dr. Jim, could you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself here, and then we can get started?
Yeah, sure. I was following Paul. I guess in traditional fashion, he popped up a little bit because of Jordan Peterson. I don't know that I'm the most typical follower of Jordan Peterson, but I certainly was aware of that, and the algorithm brought Paul up, and I really took my first conversation with him as an opportunity to kind of have conversations about these kind of important stuff. Felt like it was something that was maybe lacking in my my experience to have available conversation partners of that type, and it worked out pretty well. I felt like I enjoyed it, and it seemed to be meaningful, and so I kind of kept pursuing it. My background is, I'd say maybe different than a lot of people in this corner. I'm a bit older. My journey into Christianity is a little bit different, and maybe we could talk about that at some point. And I am kind of interested in the intersection of history, what I kind of broadly call the biggest view of the Western tradition, and these ideas as they intersect in the kind of contemporary issues that we've all been facing and have been the center of the conversation with this corner. So that's a 10,000 foot sketch. I'm
So
interested.
I'm just going to poke around a little bit here. I mentioned before we started recording that I thought it was interesting that as a cardiologist, you probably have a particular perspective on the world. And the reason I said that is because every time I've ever met any sort of a physician who has a specialty where they've actually drilled down far enough into some little corner of the human physiognomy, they tend to have a particular view of the world that's a little bit more connected to meaning rather than just strictly material processes. So I don't know if that connects at all to how you think about things as a cardiologist, but
Yeah, I think it does. I would say there's kind of two sides to that story. Definitely kind of come from a kind of academic kind of science-based origin without in my youth, even into my 20s, without a real Christian focus of my experience at that time. So very secular scientific view of at least my profession. So and there's that part of it as for sure that you want to do your best to do what's right, and to the degree that what's right is defined by the science of medicine. We certainly are constantly engaged with the science of medicine, the latest studies, the way those studies play into how we treat the imperfections and all of that, for sure. But nonetheless, the goal, the ideal, is to do that, and it's very, very much focused on a scientific view of all of that. At the same time, I would say the reason that I moved to study medicine was focused on trying to use my capabilities. I don't know that I was the smartest guy that ever went through school, but I knew I was, at least capable of putting in the work and succeeding enough to make that happen when I was younger. And I wanted what I was doing to be meaningful, and meaningful in a relational way with people in important moments, of their lives. And this seemed to be a very natural combination of those two things. And ended up with cardiology, which does have, it's a wide variety of stuff. Technology is a part of why I like it, et cetera. But it is, very, highly concentrated moments in people's lives, important moments in people's lives, difficult moments in people's lives, and being alongside people, being a friend, a partner, someone who can share and hopefully give confidence to people in a difficult moment, love them in the broadest sense of that word, is a big part of how I, let's say, attempt to do what I do on a daily basis. So it does have that kind of breadth and variety of ways of interacting with it at the center of it, the kind of love and connection with individual patients who are in a moment that's very important and difficult for them in many cases. So that's how I see that, and I think it's been good. I've really been fortunate and blessed in my career, so I haven't had kind of difficulties that a lot of people have in business of medicine, et cetera. So I've been very comfortable with my circumstance of work, and so it's been good that way as well.
So are you a surgeon as well?
Well, not really. At least from the inside of medicine, there's a pretty sharp division between what we count as surgeons, and they train on a different track. You mentioned internal medicine earlier. Way back in history, kind of the surgeons and internal medicine kind of split, and the training is separate. And cardiology, my specialty is on the internal medicine side of that, so it's not really surgery. Although over time, we've developed a lot of procedures, what we would call procedures rather than surgeries, that are part of what I do. So people might be familiar with cardiac catheterization, coronary angiography, pacemakers, that kind of thing, which aren't really surgeries, or they're kind of small surgeries, we'd say, I guess. So
you quite often have somebody's life basically in your hands.
Yeah, I guess that's not an exaggeration, although, nowadays, medicine is a very complicated thing. It's also a very system-based thing. There's a lot of people, highly trained, highly capable people who are all together doing this practice and taking care of the patients. So there's a whole lot of support, and a lot of the systems are also present to make sure that we're doing the best we can to do the best we can for the patient. But yes, there are moments of where the patient has a critical issue, and fortunately, we know in many of those cases we can do very specific things to help them get through those moments, and it has that kind of intensity as a part of it, for sure.
It seems also to have the necessary quality of community as being very, very important to what you do. If you're working together with so many other people who have their own specialties to make sure that things work out well for the patient. And
yeah, it is a little bit of a different, well, I don't know if I'd say a difference, but I do have a little bit of a different perspective, I think, on the question of, the kind of the difficulties we're having with authority in the culture, difficulties we're having with systems that seem to be moving towards a sense of being oppressive in some ways. And I wouldn't discount any of those things that people experience in different realms. But I do have a little bit of a different experience of that from what I do, which is that the system is very important. It's a legacy. It's a long-standing thing that's been developed over many years, and it's very valuable. And I'm, in that sense, I am very much in support of at least the ideal of continuing that and making that as good as we can in terms of how patients get cared for. So
yeah, kind of like Jordan Peterson always says, you have to go into the belly of the whale to rescue your father. And a lot of these traditions that have made our lives better and have given us a more flourishing community, neighborhood, nation, all of this are in such danger now from people who want to come in and tear the systems apart. So we have to have people who are in favor of keeping the systems operating functionally. So
yeah, I was trained in a time, and I think this is still the case, but trained in a time when you were kind of geared toward or pointed towards seeing yourself as the patient advocate. Back when I was originally trained, the physician had a more kind of elevated role. Nowadays, all of the other staff are much more elevated in terms of their professionalism and their technical skills and their training. So the physician is not quite so solely responsible for things. But nonetheless, we were trained to be the patient advocate, and kind of implied in that was that perhaps the system is a little bit blind to the individual patient, a little bit blind to what might be the differences in the way this patient needs to be treated, as opposed to someone else. And so you do take the role in a certain sense of being part of the institution, being part of the whole machine of it, but also kind of seeing yourself as working within that to even maybe push back on the machine, or create a space within the machine where the patient gets, maybe not treated so indifferently or anonymously.
well,
So,
because you're the one who has the most connection to that patient, right? I mean, you
right.
spend more time with them, you know them better, you know their situation better.
So
Yeah.
it's
That totally
interesting
makes
that topic of my profession, which, I mean, there's lots to talk about there, kind of philosophically, life and death issues, all those kinds of things. It's both not been necessarily the topic that's come up when I've talked to Paul, and in a way, not necessarily the thing that draws my interest so much, because, kind of I came to this to exercise other aspects of the way I spend my time and my thoughts. And I've really appreciated the ability to kind of, in a certain sense, be outside of that in a way.
Well, the reason I'm asking you is that as I ask you these questions, what's happening inside my head is I'm seeing this frame of how hierarchy and community and all these things that we talk about on a symbolic level, how they work in the real world, and how necessary these things are in order to have a functional society. And when we try to run away from those things, or for example, I just had a conversation with a young man who has done a lot of study in economics, and he was looking at the difference between Austrian economics and Keynesian economics. Austrian economics looks at the individual as being the important part, because the Austrian economics is based on the idea of human action and that all humans engage in purposeful behavior, where Keynesian economics is based on this idea of the aggregate, just looking at the numbers in aggregate. So I can see how in a hospital system, the system is working very well, but in general, they have to look at the patients as being in aggregate, because they're thinking about the average heart patient or the average person who's coming in for a stent, or so that they have all the system put together for the average person. But as the doctor, you're more on the side of, I know this person individually, and so as an advocate. And so this is what's going on in my head, is I'm scaling this out into all these different arenas, but it's not obvious to the people who are listening to me ask the questions. So anyway, we can move on from the whole medical thing and go to the Chino conference, because I would be very interested in hearing your feelings about it. I mean, first of all, why did you decide to go? And then what was your experience there?
Well, it was an opportunity that I could go. First off, I wanted to go to Thunder Bay, and that didn't work out, just scheduling wise, et cetera. So it turned out that I could make that trip happen. So that was one reason. But yeah, I wanted to make it real. I wanted to be, kind of with people face to face. I had already met with Jonathan Pajot on a separate conference that was up near Seattle, which is kind of close to where I'm at. And I enjoyed that. And I had this experience at that conference in Seattle that was just parallel to what happened in Chino, which is that you just walk in and it doesn't take but 5 seconds before you're just sitting down with someone talking about the common thing that we're kind of all involved with here. And it's just really engaging and enriching to have that kind of experience. And I met, and I kind of knew that was going to be the way it was. I knew I could just sit down and there'd be people who were just interested in talking. And, I kind of like the fact that maybe some people recognize me and have heard what I've said, even though to some degree, some of my inputs, I cringe at a little bit, but nonetheless, I like the fact that people, kind of come up and say, "Oh, you're Dr. Jim, and I like this," and then we get to talk. It's just a lot of fun, and and I wanted to make it, face to face and real. And then, a guy like John Vervaeke, and Pajot has got more status than he did before. I wanted to kind of engage with those people as well. And on top of all that, Paul is, I'm pretty sure that this is not true for me alone, but more than Jordan Peterson, more than Pajot or Vervaeke, Paul is somehow a center of this thing for me. His kind of loving demeanor and his calm equanimity about the whole thing, and his position as a kind of committed Christian, all of those things make him the center of this whole experience for me. And I had not met him before, so this was an opportunity for me to meet Paul as well.
So for someone who is not familiar with what we're doing here, when you say you got there and all of a sudden you could just have a conversation about the thing that we're about,
right?
How would you describe that thing that we're about?
Yeah. And now you're going to, and now I don't know how I'm going to, I don't know what it is. Yeah, I don't know. It's, I think it's a sense, well, for me, it's really a sense that people are engaged in interesting ways, grappling with the important, kind of issues of being a human being, and thinking about those in connection with, institutions like churches, various ways of configuring those churches, different denominations, non-Christians, people in university thinking about ideas like cognitive science, people who have read parts of the Western tradition that are very valuable to me. I've mentioned this before, but I have a very particular interest in T.S. Eliot and love particularly one of his poems called Four Quartets. And I met probably 4 or 5 people who, maybe not to the depth that I've kind of been obsessed with that, but knew that enough to have a real conversation about it. Whereas in my normal life, my work life, my friends, my other connections that I have, not so interested in that stuff. So they don't really know it. So it's not really a topic where we can engage on it. So, and there's more than just that. The particular issues of what Vervaeke has called the meaning crisis, and how that interacts with the way kind of our scientific culture has developed in the last multiple decades, I think is something that was always interesting to me before this started, and I think that kind of conversation has gotten very rich in this corner. People are trying to come at that problem from different directions and have very interesting takes on that. And so those are some thoughts. I mean, there's probably even more to it than that, but.
I always find it interesting because I was at some work function of my husband's. His company had invited us all to a lovely vacation in Hawaii. but I mean, it was all with his work colleagues. And one evening I was sitting there talking with this other couple, and for some reason I mentioned the YouTube channel, and they said, well, what is it about? And as I was trying to explain to them what I was doing, they just looked at me like I was
Yeah.
from another planet.
Yeah,
They couldn't,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
they just couldn't. So then I started to say, well, there's this guy, Jordan Peterson. And then I tried to describe him, and then it got worse. So, I
Yeah,
think
I was
part
going
of
to
the
even ask.
problem is we get this, we're so up in our, a little bit, we're up in our heads here, and
Mhm.
we're enjoying these ideas so much. And so we enjoy each other so much, but then we have to take this back into our real life. And if we can't translate those ideas into some sort of action that we have with our families and our neighbors that don't know anything about this stuff, without being able to explain to them what we're doing, we have to just turn it into some sort of action that has meaning and purpose in our lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that Paul's concept of the on-ramp, people need some sort of context to understand what we're talking, what we're kind of doing here. And it's really hard in kind of normal activities to give them that context. I've got the joy of my son and my other kids as well have been engaged in conversations like this previously. So Kevin and my son, have had these kinds of conversations going back a number of years since he was in high school, and he's a very kind of thinker kind of a guy, although he's into the mystics, and he's writes poetry, and he writes music. So we have that commonality, and that's been great as well. Although even since then, I have two daughters as well, and the whole family have gotten a habit of doing kind of a book club kind of experience that we do weekly, where we have similar kinds of conversations, which
Wow.
to some degree have grown out of this process that's been going on. So that's been really, it's kind of translated back into my life to some degree too.
Well, so what are some of the books that your family has been reading together in your book club?
Well, for so far it's been movies. We watched Silence. I don't know if you know that movie. It's a movie about from a book written by a Japanese
Fujimura, or
yeah
yes.
About the 16th century.
Yes, I read that book when I was a missionary in Japan.
Oh, you were a missionary in Japan. Wow.
35 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a very intense movie. It's got a lot of thoughtful,
very intense book.
Yes. So we read the book, watched the movie, and then we've had like 3 conversations about that. We're moving on to some poetry that my daughter wants to talk about, and we're going to kind of try to pass the leadership of the conversation around between us. And so far it's been really kind of fun.
That's such a great idea. I wonder if I can talk my family.
It was something that I thought, well, I don't know, because they don't listen to what I do with Paul. No one else really does.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how's this going to work? But Kevin and I already had a context to have conversations, and the rest came on, and we keep the topics such that it's something we commonly might, that all of us might be interested in. So
yeah. I think that's one of the biggest issues that I tried to kind of get some ideas about when I was at Chino, is how could we develop, not necessarily an on-ramp, but how could we develop language around this that simplifies the concepts, not dumbing them down, but sort of collapsing them into their essence, so that each of these concepts could be, like, for example, Jordan Peterson did this whole lecture at Ephesus, the Logos at Ephesus, that he did for the master's class in the first cohort at Ralston College.
I was aware of that, although I didn't listen to it.
excellent lecture, just excellent lecture. But the way he gave that lecture, he sort of gave you the whole background and the big picture, but then as he kind of wound it down, he simplified until he got to the very end. The basic theme of the whole thing was meaning precedes matter. And then I realized, well, of course, that's the theme of his whole book, Maps of Meaning. Meaning precedes matter. So that is a very simple statement that you can make with somebody, and then they can say, well, what exactly does that mean? And then you can explain it a little bit more, and then you can flesh it out a little bit more. So you're starting with the simple thing and then moving outward instead of starting with this whole great big behemoth that we carry around in our heads.
Yeah.
And try to explain that, you know.
Yeah, and I've thought of trying to do this a little bit with other realms, you know, other kind of circles of contacts that I have. I'm thinking maybe more the context, you know, like setting up something that's on a topic that we know we have shared interest, and, you know, getting together for coffee on a regular basis. And I don't know, I've had the thought of doing that, and it hasn't quite turned into anything yet at that level. So
I did try several years ago before COVID, and we actually had a pretty good group going of having a meetup. I think we met maybe 5 times altogether before COVID hit, and then we couldn't meet anymore because we were meeting at my house. I tried to do it online a couple of times after that, but there were like 15 to 20 people. It's just very unwieldy to try to have anything online, and I just gave it up. But when we were having it, then each week we would pick a topic, like maybe a video, and then we would talk about that and talk about the ideas in it. And it was wonderful. I mean, not all the people were as avid fans of Jordan Peterson, but they all had some understanding, and so we could talk about ideas in that way. And I thought it was very helpful. It wasn't exactly the estuary idea because the estuary idea hadn't been formulated yet, but I would say we ran it pretty much like an estuary where everybody was free to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about and try to keep any one person from
dominating too much. Yeah, it's facilitating those kinds of things is difficult.
Yeah.
What, you know, I've watched your channel a number of times, not religiously, but a number of times. And what I've come away with is that you're wide ranging in the kind of people you get to talk to, very interesting people, but very wide ranging. Do you think you can give a thematic description of what you're trying to do?
Well, I try not to talk about it too much when I'm doing the channel, because part of my goal is to open a space for people to think about these things, and maybe they'll land in the same place that I've landed. But when I started the channel, my thought was that in my head, there's this big picture. And I mean, you know, there are different frames of reference for how we look at the world. And somebody who's into economics, they can begin to see, oh yeah, there's a lot of things about reality that are related to economics all the way down. And you're a cardiologist, and so you can look at the human physiology, the human organism, and you can see that there are certain similarities there to the way the whole universe scales. And so in every domain of knowledge, there's some sort of frame that you can put on that has that picture. Well, for me, it's building a work of art, the process of painting a painting and what all is involved in that. I began to see that that is a frame that fits on every single domain of knowledge. And there are certain principles that are involved in that building a work of art that are deep principles in almost every arena of science and physics and philosophy and history and
so
all different art forms. And so that's what I've been exploring. I've been trying to talk to people and see if that original thought holds water in all these different areas. And so as I talk to people, the questions I ask are, for me, sort of dedicated to get them talking about things that will help me see if it's fitting inside this frame.
I like that. And I noticed that about it. Certainly you have the paintings. I'm assuming the paintings are your paintings.
Yeah.
I like the music that you start with, the cello suite. And it got me thinking about something that I've been kind of working on, this idea I mentioned in our email about formation.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me go down this path, and I'll see what you think about it. First, I would take an idea of, well, the formation idea that I talked with Paul about relative to Vervaeke. Now, I don't want to speak like I know John Vervaeke. I don't, but I do think that there's something about his story that plays out in his thinking, in his thought, and what he's actually doing. So as an example, he talks about his first experience with Plato, particularly Socrates, and how profound that moment was when he kind of confronted the kind of famous centerpiece of Plato and Socrates being the most important thing that I know is that I don't know. And as I've thought about that with Vervaeke, I was interested in how I had a very different impression of Plato when I first read Plato. When I was in college, probably was the first time I really, wouldn't say I seriously read Plato, but read Plato in a philosophy class. And my reaction to that line was exactly the opposite. It was like, this is supposed to be profound, but I knew that I didn't know anything. And it made me think about Vervaeke's formation and realized, and again, I'm reading into John Vervaeke's life, so forgive me for that. But he came from a kind of difficult Christian background, a difficult formation in a fundamentalist background, which he is open about talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that the reason that he resonated with the idea of someone declaring so forcefully that they don't know comes from the fact that he had been hurt and had a difficult time with a kind of worldview and a community that wanted to say, you've got to know this. This is the truth. And because that was such a painful place, that kind of view of the world, that there's a fixed single truth, was something he had to move away from. And when he saw in something like Socrates the opposite statement, it opened a whole world up for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really, I think, is kind of, in a certain sense, where he's going with this. He's working on these technologies, in these kind of abstract psychotechnologies, as he talks about it, and it's all to kind of rebuild the world in a setting where you can feel open to investigate and not necessarily have a fixed dogmatic starting point. And that's my thought on Vervaeke, and then I can maybe twist this over to my own history, unless you want to throw in a few comments on that.
Well, I would like to follow up just a little bit on this idea of not knowing. We could spend hours talking about that, but the big idea that I run into with quite a few people, there was a guy who was in this little corner quite vociferously for the first couple of years and has sort of backed away. It was a guy by the name of Carl. And Carl could be pretty forceful in the comment sections. And Carl really resisted the whole idea of God number two. He was really a person who believed very strongly in God number one, because he did believe that there was a moral structure to the universe, but he resisted the idea that there was an actual God that could be personal or could be connected to people in any way. And he would often talk about the idea that truth is unknowable. And so I kept trying to find, I had many conversations with him, and I was trying to find a place where we could have a meeting of the minds, where I could see that maybe through a different lens, I could understand what he was talking about. And I think a lot about what Paul says when he kind of talks about C.S. Lewis's idea that we go further up and further in. And there was another guy that had been on Paul's channel early on by the name of Chris Wilson, who was a architect and very interested in mathematics. And he talks about the asymptote in calculus and how it approaches the axis, but it never touches the axis as it's going up. And so to me, that was a visual picture of further up and further in. And in that sense, I can think of Christ as being the truth, and we can never get there perfectly. We can never perfectly align ourselves with Christ, because then we would be him, right? But we can get closer and closer and closer. And so I think there is a truth in science that you can get closer and closer to the truth through theorizing and experimenting and coming to deeper and deeper understandings, but you're never going to actually get something and say, now this is the truth, and it's never going to be changed, except for the truths that relate to Christ. And so that's where you sort of come to this sticking point, you know?
Yeah, I'm a guy who wants particulars in that area. Well, I guess I'd say it this way. I do have a little bit of I don't know how to put it. I do think that truths are contextual. Truths are things that find themselves in a world. And so the setting in which you're talking is going to set the parameters of what it is that is going to end up being considered rock solid. It's rock solid, but it's just rock solid in a context. And then, of course, we're all, so that's the way I see science, for example. If you turn to the world and look at everything you encounter as an effect, then you can work out finding lots of causes, and that could be very helpful. So the frame is, you start by looking at everything as an effect, and you're going to, that's going to be very useful to you. But that's not the only way of framing the world. That's obviously only a very limited frame. It has doesn't help you with meaning and our dependence on each other and our our difficulties with pain and suffering, but our joys with connection to each other and with God. And so ultimately there's going to be a context in which we understand each a truth. And if for me, when you get to a thought about Christ, you're talking about the widest or most open context, and then that's where the fullness of that understanding comes. It doesn't necessarily flatten out any of those other contexts or undo the truths that you find in those contexts, but I don't know if that resonates with you. But
yeah, so you're sort of differentiating between truths and truth. And I guess,
yeah, I have a little thing about the use of the word truth, and I do think that it's a word that fudges, and I think that it is useful every now and then to go through a little exercise about how we use the word truth, because I think in a very strict sense you can focus the meaning of the word truth as a property of a truth claim. That's truth is the property of a truth claim. So if I say, the ball is red, that's not, that's going to be true or false depending on the state of affairs relative to the ball. So that's a correspondence, kind of theory of truth that I know there's been pushback on that in this corner, but then you can notice that there's, that if I say something like, it is true that the ball is red. Now that use of the word true is not really that's just a superlative or an emphasis. It doesn't really have the content, doesn't change the sentence. It's true that the ball is red is no different than the ball is red. So in that kind of epistemologic setup, you know, when you say generically something like, the gospel is the truth, then you get to decide how that all works itself out. I don't know. How does that make you feel?
Well, I guess the way I've sort of tried to parse it out in my own head is that I hadn't thought about it in terms of truth and truths, but I do think about it as Christ is the truth. I mean, that's what he says about himself. I am the truth. And then for me, it's not at all surprising that we find little pieces of truth in a lot of different arenas. And so I do believe that from the very beginning that God made the truth about himself known to his creation. But then the Tower of Babel, and here's where I expose myself. I really do believe that there was a Tower of Babel and that the languages were divided. And I think the history of language looks very much like that when you look at the language trees. But inside those languages, there are little bits of truth hidden about God. And that what became apparent to me when I was reading some books about Chinese characters when I was a missionary in Japan. You maybe know the story of Hudson Taylor when he was a missionary in China, and he discovered some of these truths buried inside the Chinese characters, and he would use them for preaching. One of them was the Chinese character for righteousness. Now, people who write Chinese characters today, in China particularly, are writing a very simplified version. So it's not the same version that Taylor was using. But, you know, Chinese characters are built of these little boxes. So in one Chinese character, there might be two boxes, one on top of each other, or there might be two boxes, one beside each other, or there might be four boxes. But in the one for righteousness, there's two boxes, one on top and one on the bottom. The one on top is a Chinese character for lamb, and the one on the bottom is the Chinese character for me. So righteousness is lamb over me.
Now, how do they talk about that? How do they explain that?
Well,
how do the Chinese explain that?
These characters have a thousands of year history,
right?
them,
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
I'm not sure that there
isn't any they to explain it. Yeah. It's just the tradition. Yeah.
But
wow, that's pretty interesting.
Right. To me, that was part of the truth that language group took with it when it went. And then, so in the way I picture it is there's these little pieces of truth in all these different language groups that went out and then became different cultures. And over time, sin corrupts. And I mean, they were already corrupted at the Tower of Babel, and things get a little bit twisted.
And then the different cultures don't match up anymore. The languages are going in different directions. Yeah.
And everybody has their own, and these little pieces of truth might have gotten shifted, and they're looking through a kaleidoscope and they don't quite see it the way they used to see it. And so, but it's not surprising to find little pieces of truth everywhere. That does not negate that Christ himself is truth, and that there is a larger truth that all of these little pieces of truth were originally part of. And and then the other thing is there's this physicist named Nima Arkani Hamed, and some people on my channel probably think you're beating a dead horse, Karen. But Glenn, who's a physicist I've talked to a number of times, told me about Nima Arkani Hamed and how he had done this. He's a particle physicist, and he's extremely well known in physics circles. He had done a talk, which has sort of been buried because physicists aren't supposed to talk about this kind of thing. And he was talking about the morality of fundamental physics. Or is it the fundamental morality of physics? I can never remember which it is. But he was saying that when you're a scientist working in physics, that you have to have a certain moral temperament that you're unwilling to accept anything less than um, the as true an outcome as you can find. Because if you're willing to fudge some um, outcome from an experiment in order to polish yourself up a little bit, or to, write a paper that makes you famous, it will find you out, because these things have a way of finding people out. So you have to be rigorously a person of integrity in order to do physics. And then he talked about what he calls the two mountains. And he showed the mountain of Newtonian physics and how it's perfect and it works. And it's been useful even to send people to the moon. But then along came Einsteinian physics, which encompasses Newtonian physics, but is outside of it in a taller mountain. But you can stand at the top of Mount Einstein and look out, and you can still see the mountain of Newton. Newton's truth hasn't been diminished over the years. It's still there, but now there is what this guy called a larger truth in Einsteinian physics. And that there'll be another mountain beyond that that's going to look back at Einstein and say, yeah, he had part of it, but that wasn't the whole thing. And now there's this new mountain.
Yeah, I play in all these sandboxes, but I'm not really in them. Although
Yeah.
I did study in college. My pre-med was studying physics, and I was all interested in the ideas of, Einstein when I was in high school and all that. That was kind of one of my early little passions, although I only, that didn't last all that long, but I did have a lot of interest in this. And I would say there's another way of looking at the question of Newton being nested within Einstein. And I'd be
maybe he didn't say nested, but he said
right?
you can look at Newton's mountain from the mountaintop of Einstein.
Yeah. So I'd be interested in talking to you about this, because there is a very interesting book in the middle of the 20th century by a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the Structure of a Scientific Revolution is, I think, the name of the book. And in there, he, because everyone had kind of run with the understanding that if you take the equations of Einstein and then you put in the parameters of large objects, you're going to end up with and cross off the remainders that are too small to count when you're talking about larger objects. Well, then the formula is just reduced to the formulas of Newton. So in that sense, the Einstein tells you more about a larger domain, but it also tells you about the domain that Newton's physics was about. But if you think about it for a minute, you'll realize that there's actually a very clear difference between the worlds that Newton was talking about and the world that Einstein was talking about. And if you think about just the equation F equals ma, which is Newton, force equals mass times acceleration, and you think about the E equals mc squared and the m in that, and you think, well, those are ontologic claims. Those two things are making claims about what is in the world, what a mass is. And it turns out that they're different. The m in F equals ma is an entirely different entity than the m in the E equals mc squared. And so in a way, they're really not talking about the same thing. And and I don't know if you follow that or if that impacts what his thought was. It probably doesn't. I'm sure he's fully aware of this kind of stuff.
Could you just say a bit about what is the difference between the mass in F equals ma and the mass in E equals mc squared?
Yeah, the mass in F equals ma is a entity that's located in a Cartesian grid at a certain location, and it has a property of exerting a force, the force of gravity, on other masses in the region or anywhere, frankly, in the universe, in proportion to the square of the distance between the two. So, the Earth exerts a force on the moon, and it's and nothing's going on. This was one of the discussion points around Newton for many years as to how this was supposed to work. There's this, what was referred to as spooky action at a distance, because the Earth is exerting this force on the moon, but nothing's happening in between. And it's kind of unexplainable why that might work, right? But the mass of the Earth has this power, or this force, this ability, this disposition to exert forces on other masses. That's what the mass is in Newton's story.
So, and as I understand it, whether or not that story is correct, the math works.
The math works as long as you're talking about, as long as you're in the right scale, as long as you're talking about, things of the size of planets and baseballs, and not talking about traveling at speeds that approach the speed of light. As long as you're not talking about those things, it works. The mass in the Einsteinian world is not doing that. It's quote unquote deforming the space around the mass. It's creating a effect on the actual space that the mass is in. And then another mass is over here, it's doing the same thing. And now the distortions in the space, which I can't remember how to talk too much more about it than that, but because this is long ago that I was thinking about it. But those two things are affecting the space. And you can kind of know very quickly that the Newtonian thing is not going to work, because if you imagine a thought experiment of making the moon disappear in an instant, just it's there one moment and it's not there the next. The question would be, what would the effect on the tides be? How the tides are being held up by the moon, right? How would that effect occur in the tide? Well, Newton's mechanics would say that there would be an instantaneous effect on the tides. As soon as the moon disappeared, the effect would occur. Well, that's obviously not going to work, because there's ultimately a duration that it takes for the loss of the mass of the moon to have its effect on the tides, and that is accounted for in Einstein's theories, that there's an effect on the space that's intervening, and then that transmits through the space in a finite amount of time. And so you can see that the differences there account for things like that, and then obviously very much more. I don't know, and that means that the ontologies of the two theories are different. That they're calling out different actual things in the world. And of course, we're going to believe that Einstein is correct and Newton was not in that. But that kind of means that while it was functional, and then there's this question about practical truth, utilitarian truth, it was functional and created the modern world in a lot of different ways. It was not really talking about real entities in the world.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there's two aspects of it. I think Nima Arkani Hamed is talking about the idea that it's functional. The math works. It's sort of like, in Jordan Peterson's framework, it's sort of like ideological purity. It's got its own thing, right?
Yeah.
And then there's Einsteinian physics, which has its own worldview, its own way of looking at things. The other thing is that Newtonian mechanics, as I understand it, is based on this idea that the universe is kind of like clockwork. And Einsteinian physics leaves a little bit more room for some of these other complexities that maybe aren't taken into account in Newton. And so there's a little bit more room for, I mean, some people would say there's more room for woo, but
well, and the other thing you can say is that while we are ready to, well, I'm ready to say, because I'm talking about this stuff, but I'm only I don't know, an amateur or something, I don't know. But we can say that Newton is not calling out real entities in the world. In other words, when M doesn't represent something that really exists, we can probably say the same thing about Einstein. In other words, we can say that that's an incomplete theory. And Einstein knew this himself, that it wasn't a complete theory. It didn't encompass everything, gravitational waves, quantum mechanics, all the the unified field theory idea that he spent the last half of his life trying to figure out is kind of admitting that there's an incompleteness to those theories. And therefore we can kind of think that the newer theories have the same relationship to whatever is out there in the world for real, as we just said that the Newtonian one does. In other words, they're not necessarily calling out, this would make me a non-scientific realist. In other words, the structure of these conceptual frameworks work to give us information about what's going to happen in experiments and in configuring, doing engineering of solid state circuitry, et cetera. But it's still an open question as to whether it's reasonable to talk about the real existence of an electron, or, that's still an open conversation and not necessarily resolved as yet, as far as I understand it.
Well, this is one of the things I like about Stephen Wolfram's new fundamental physics, because while he may be right or wrong in his formulation of this new physics, he does have a picture of how things work that I think is pretty helpful. And that is that all of these different things depend on who the observer is. So we are as human beings, we are a particular kind of observers, and we see things at a particular scale. And therefore, we see patterns in the universe that maybe something at a larger scale or a smaller scale wouldn't recognize those patterns, but we recognize them. And he calls these slices of computational reducibility. So when Einstein came up with E equals mc squared, that's a slice of computational reducibility. And there are things about Einsteinian physics where the whole thing is a slice of computational reducibility. It's something that we can get hold of, and we can use it computationally to manipulate our world. But most of the universe is computationally irreducible. So it just depends on certain kinds of observers in certain locations as to how they see things. And so,
this was kind of what I was saying earlier on, where I was saying that truths find themselves in a particular context.
Yes.
I was doing math-based physics in college, and there were, in all of the problems that you do, just a student kind of problem, there are what are referred to as boundary conditions. And the boundary conditions set the edges, set the kind of the edges of the problem, and they allow you to solve the problem. That is to say, if you don't have any boundary conditions, then there's not going to be, I can't even think up an example, but if you don't have a boundary condition, which is kind of setting the context where the problem is to be run, well, then you can't solve the equation. So, so you're always in some sort of a perspective. There's always a setup to the problem, and that setup will allow for, kind of constants to be entered in to the formulas, and then a number will come out. And as long as you set the experiment up that way, the answer is going to be the one that you generate. But if you just try to have it answer the question about everything at once, you're really going to not have an answer.
Well, I mean, this is one of the principles that I ran into in art. If you don't set the boundary conditions before you start, you can't, basically you can't move forward at all.
Right. It's the medium you're using.
Computationally irreducible, right. You can't make your way through the field of potential. So
yeah, exactly. Too many options. Computational explosion.
Yeah. And but I like that when you use the terminology used, where you said the boundary conditions set the edges of the problem. The other thing that brings up for me is that so many scientists say that they are, strictly scientific, and everything is reductionist to materialist, and you don't need any personal input into that. But every single time they run any sort of an experiment, they're the ones that set the boundary conditions.
Right.
Every single time. We can't run any experiment without touching it, without having some sort of human input in it, even if it's, they say, oh, well, a machine could be the observer. Well, yes, a machine could be the observer, but somebody made the machine, you know.
Yeah,
So
I
at
think it's
some
even
point, there's a
in a
human
way
touch.
it's even worse than that, because what that kind of scientific attitude will do is that it'll say, well, you'll say, well, wait a minute, you had a purpose in running that experiment. So that's bringing in something that's not materialistic, a purpose, a telos. But then what they'll want to do with that, a kind of pure reductionist will want to do with that, is they'll want to kind of create a kind of deflated domain of kind of psychology, or that's just mind, and that's just people, culture, all that stuff is in some sense, by that move, is kind of has a deflated sense of importance. And that's, I think, one of the real destructive parts of the materialistic worldview that has come, kind of with so much momentum from the past, is that it's taken things that we all accept. It's not like the scientist doesn't, love his dog and love his children and all that, but it's created this circumstance where we could just naturally, without thinking about it, diminish the importance of things that are quite obviously the most important things, the meanings of things, and the meanings of our relationships, and the meaning of doing the experiment. And this can, of course, become a way in which science becomes itself destructive, because there's some notion that, well, the doing the science is separate from, let's say, the moral implications of doing the science. And I'll leave that to some other person to figure out the morality of what I'm doing. That's just psychology, or that's just philosophy, or that's just some lesser thing, the humanities, or, I don't know what, politics, or whatever it is. I'm just going to do my little experiment here. And that's a kind of attitude that hopefully we're kind of moving away from some. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think we're moving further and further into it, faster and faster.
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, I hear more and more of these people saying, well, mind is just the brain, and brain is just the neurons.
Right.
The neurons are just the electrical impulses, and
right. And the most
no
important word in those sentences is just, meaning it's a move to diminish the importance of it, without any reason to diminish the importance of it. There's no justification for that diminishment, and yet that's what that's doing, is it's reducing the importance of those important things.
Well, and as C.S. Lewis pointed out, decades and decades ago, if you keep making that move, then just your experiment is completely meaningless, because it's just neurons firing somewhere accidentally because of some particle that started moving 13.7 billion years ago. And
more importantly, you raise a generation, or more than one generation, of young people to think that reductive materialism is, in some sense, the foundation of our knowledge, and any sense of kind of meaningful engagement with these other issues becomes ignored. And then we don't even know, we don't have the skills, we don't have the psychotechnologies, we don't have the ability in our communication with each other, and our politics, and our human relations, to actually work these things out, work out the important issues of what choices we're making with that very technology. We've lost the tools to actually make those kinds of choices.
Well, so you said when you were a young man, I think in your 20s, you saw the world through this materialist lens, and you studied medicine through that materialist lens. And at what point did you start thinking that there was something beyond that? And at that point, did you start reading ancient literature, or
yeah, it's a little different. I talk about that in a little bit of a different way. I have a very, I think, an eclectic Christian faith. And I don't think, well, I grew up and had I lived in a kind of secular world. My parents were Methodists in their, in the family. They had gone to a Methodist university, in fact, met there, but my father became a physician and they moved distant from their family. And due to the circumstances of the environment, we, and my parents' choice, we kind of stopped. Maybe when I was an infant, we'd gone to church, but pretty much between my time I remember all the way into my 20s, we really didn't have a context of conversation of any significance in terms of Christianity. And so I grew up into that, but I don't know how to, tried to talk about this before. It's kind of difficult, but I had my awakening, my coming to recognize myself, my separation from, self identity, and had a kind of normal, I think, moment of recognition and the alienation that comes along with that, kind of youthful alienation of, recognizing that my parents are not the ideals that I thought that they were, and that I was an independent. I was independent of others, and had a kind of angsty, kind of alienation moment, kind of like you might read in Catcher in the Rye, that kind of thing, and kind of worked through that in a much more secular kind of vein. And that's where I picked up my love for kind of literature and art, because I was searching for examples. I was searching for art to tell my story. I wasn't searching for art to teach me how to navigate as much as I was, show me that I wasn't alone in my kind of moment of ennui, or whatever you want to call it. And I found art and literature, in a low level when I was in high school. Music. I'm a late 70s kid, so things like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and that kind of thing, Bob Dylan. Those things were important to me. And then when I went to college, it was more high culture. Hamlet was very important to me when I was young. Things like that. I read the classics and framed kind of internalizing them as the kind of models for my own experience, and didn't really feel like I needed, it wasn't a deconstruction. It wasn't like I needed something. I wanted to be in community with, I wanted to have something that helped me to emote the experience of that, but didn't necessarily feel, as I've heard a lot of people talk about, a crisis or a need to escape the secular world and find a purer place. And I don't know if I'm expressing this very well, but ultimately, as I lived through, my young adulthood, came to see that the Christian narrative, essentially seen as a narrative in the Western tradition, was actually the best reflection of what I experienced. And so it wasn't a kind of moment of metanoia, or kind of being born again, or transitioning into a new kind of frame of view, but rather recognizing that this was the highest expression of human experience. And that's how I came to Christianity. It's a little different than I think others, but.
Well, was T.S. Eliot, was your interest in T.S. Eliot prior to that or after that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because I read T.S. Eliot well before I was a Christian, and kind of didn't really recognize, seems ridiculous to me now, but didn't really
I mean, I read a
recognize.
lot of T.S. Eliot
Yeah.
in college, but
Yeah.
must have gone right over my head. It never
Yeah.
occurred to me that was anything about faith in there.
Yeah. Anyway, I've loved it. I've told this story, Paul. I had an aunt when I was in college, before I was a Christian, who wasn't a real close aunt, so I don't want to overstate the emotional event that this was, but it was a real event. She committed suicide, and it was a big, medium-sized deal, let's say, in our family. And in a way that was not wrong, so I'm not kind of trying to characterize my family members in a negative way, but I was at college, I was away from home. It would have been difficult for me to go to the funeral. It was all the way across the country. There wasn't any conversation about that. But I found out later that my two sisters and my parents had gone to her funeral. And it wasn't that I was angry about that. I was not. But it made me realize that I did not have the vehicle. I did not have the communal vehicle to experience that moment. So it went by me as an event that I knew was important, I knew was meaningful, and yet I didn't have the context in which to actually emote about it, to be with other people in the moment of this very, kind of fairly important event. And I realized that was a mistake, that not having the communal structures around which to make real, let's say, in an emotional sense and in a communal sense, in a group sense, to make real those kinds of big events, not having those structures is destructive and not the right way to engage things. Mm-hmm. And so later I come to see that Christianity is, if it's at its best for me, it's the structures for having those experiences in the real way that we need to experience them. And I don't know if that resonates, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar outcome. I wouldn't say it's a similar experience maybe, but my brother was killed in a small plane crash when I was 41 and I was 40 and he was 45 maybe. He's 5 years older than me. But I had just gone to Japan as a missionary. Mm-hmm. And my husband and I were there, and I didn't feel like we had the money that I could go back for the funeral. Sure. And this had happened in Alaska. And it also happened to be a time at which my parents had a falling out. They had gone to Florida for the winter. They had a kind of a falling out in Florida, and my mother had returned home to Iowa, and my father had stayed in Florida. And then my brother died. So my parents are separated, and neither of them could go to the funeral. It was such a complicated, difficult, painful time. I couldn't go to the funeral. Basically, in other words, we left my brother's wife and his 2 kids to navigate that by themselves. I always felt like there was just no closure. There was nothing to finish that, right? And I had, for many other reasons, I had a lot of reasons to grieve over my brother's death. And when that kind of thing happens and you don't have that fellowship with other people, and you don't have, and I was not, I was a Christian at the time, but my parents were not Christians. My brother and his family were not Christians. They had no family in the church to come around them. It's a very tough time.
Yes, this is, I do, kind of in a way, the abstractions that we talk about are maybe less important than the liturgy of it or the sacramentality of it.
Yeah, for sure.
And Shakespeare doesn't do that. It isn't in Shakespeare. Although, there's lots, you go to a play, you can emote together in a group and all that, but and it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. It could be, Taylor Swift concert or whatever. But it isn't the same thing. The elevation of the whatever, the elevation of Jesus Christ to the highest is the thing that that makes it meaningful. I don't want to say that makes it meaningful, but it's the truth. And so it has more gravity and more import than does, other kinds of, let's say, works of art or literature, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of that is that whole thing when you were talking about things being nested inside of other things. I mean, that is one place where everything is nested inside of that picture, right? Everything.
That's right. Even you as an individual, and it's moved to this for me as well, because a lot of the struggles that we face alone, and if there's nothing proximal to you, if Jesus cannot be there, in the moment of, then it's a pretty bleak image.
Yeah, I mean, I fully remember when both my parents were dying, they went through a kind of a long ordeal of dying, and it was right after my husband had left me. So I had returned from Japan to my home church, and people were very gracious and would come around and say, how's your mother doing? How's your father doing? And I knew that they were doing that because they cared about my feelings. They cared, they wanted to pray, so they wanted updates. But after a while, I felt as though I was just a medical update machine, and there was no real fellowship and there was no real comfort in that, because at the end of the day, nobody else could understand what was going on inside of me, as hard as they might try. And even if they would come and sit beside me, which many of them did, and came along and did very practical things for me, which was all wonderful, but nobody could understand what I was going through. Only Christ. And because I knew that Christ could understand what I was going through, then I had a friend to walk through that with. And if I hadn't, I don't know what people do when there's not a single human being or person that they can talk to about what they're experiencing, because some things are so very hard to put into words. You can't explain them to somebody else, especially when it comes to pain. It gets so tangled up with everything in your life.
Yeah, and if we decide, and it's a decision, if we decide that we're going to think of the world as in the way that a reductive materialist does, and if we teach our kids that, and then all we're doing there is just saying, well, then when you're in your room alone, you're really alone. That's the metaphysic. That's the ontology of that view. And, there could be other ways of framing it besides a Christian way, but it certainly is, that's certainly a bleak view. If you don't recognize the implication of what you're saying about your experience, then it can be very difficult for people, I would assume. Here's another little direction. Your song, the piece that you choose. This is an aesthetic move. I don't know if we have time for this.
Oh, sure. Okay. But I mean, I have to tell you, in full disclosure, I had nothing whatever to do with that
is that right?
opening. There's a young guy that was part of the corner. I'm assuming he still is. His name is Chris Petkow. And he had his own channel for a while. I don't know if he's still doing it. And he was very good at putting clips together on his channel. And I told him one time when he was on my channel, I said, I don't know how to do that. I mean, this is why I don't have any B-roll or anything like that on my channel. And I said, I would love to have an intro that was interesting and that would capture people's attention, but I don't know how to do it. And he said, I'd be happy to do that for you.
And you got these paintings of cello players, so there you go.
He came up with the whole thing. He went to my website. He got all the paintings off of there.
Do you like the mood that it sets? Because that's where I wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought what he picked was brilliant. I mean, maybe at this point now, I might make it shorter.
Yeah,
I think it's a little bit long, but I don't know how to do that.
Well, here's my thought. This is a different version of the Vervaeke, effort to try to develop psychotechnologies for the meaning crisis.
Okay.
And that is is the blues. Because for me, and the cello suite that you've got has got a little bit of somberness to it, but it's gloriously beautiful. And that kind of, I told you before that I kind of, in my youth, I had this kind of ennui, this kind of, kind of sense of the pain of human existence and the tragedy of human history and all of that, and sought out in art, some sort of way through that. And, I come to find, I look back and I think of kind of the idea of, let's just say the blues is a good example of this, because the blues has at its base this kind of recognition of the tragedy of human experience. And yet it's married up with, in a way that's very difficult to kind of describe or see how you would flesh it out, a kind of uplifting joy that's kind of just embedded in the very nature of that musical form. And so in a way, it takes the meaning crisis seriously. It takes the difficulty that we face, just in our existential circumstance seriously, but it also marries it up with a kind of uplifting, joyful, essentially joyful, or at least redemptive content, emotional content. And that, that is better than the kind of harsh world of the kind of new atheists. I don't know if that works for you, but I do think that kind of vision can put together authenticity in our facing the difficulties, but at the same time, a redemptive sense. And that's one of the ways that art works for me, is a kind of aesthetic of that type.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that whole idea of redemptive, because that was the turning point for me in the way that I did art. There was a certain point that I went from doing strictly representational art to doing work that was a little bit more experimental. And it happened one time when I was trying to do a portrait of a woman friend of mine who was a paraplegic. She and her husband and their 10-year-old baby had been thrown out of their car when they were broadsided. And she ended up being in a coma for many months. And when she came out of the coma, she was paralyzed from maybe the shoulders down or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
So at the time I knew her, she had a 3-year-old daughter, and the 3-year-old daughter was sitting on her lap in a wheelchair. And so I was taking all sorts of photographs of them, and I wanted to do a portrait of her to show her strength and her determination and her beauty. And I tried many different times, and I just couldn't come up with something that I liked. And so finally, one day, out of desperation, I took another portrait that I had done of another woman, and I turned it upside down, and I started to paint this woman over the top of it. And I found that there was something redemptive and something powerful about fighting against this other image. So my choices were being based not on a white canvas, but they were based on what fit into the context of this old image. So it was like I was, in a sense, redeeming the past, which is kind of the way I thought about her life. And forever after that, when I painted, I would always try to either redeem an old painting that way, or I would try to start with some sort of chaos on the canvas and then find the meaning in the chaos in order to draw the image out. And so that's the redemptive part of it. The other thing that made me think about when you're talking about the blues is when I was in my 30s, before I was a Christian, actually, it was when I was turning 30, I went through a period of angst, which I didn't realize had anything to do with turning 30, but somebody finally woke me up to it. Oh, it's because you're turning 30. That's why you're feeling this way.
Yep.
I started writing music. I wrote quite a bit of music, and I actually went to Nashville to promote it.
Oh, wow. Excellent.
But I went to 4 different studios, and the basic message I got from all of them was, this music is too intellectual for people, because we're trying to sell music to Nathan Nasel and his wife, who are living in a trailer, and she's got her hair up in rollers while they drink their 6-pack of beer, and you're using words like silhouette, and it's not going to work. But anyway, one of the songs that I wrote was a blues number, and
You
I
you
won't
place
I won't sing it for you, but I'll tell you
yeah.
the words. Time is a quiet river, relentless as a dream, carrying me forward no matter how hard I scheme. If I tarry to the right or I tarry to the left, this ever rolling stream, no, if I tarry to the left or I tarry to the right, this ever rolling stream is going to carry me into the night. So find a good road and follow it along. Try to live your whole life through standing clean and strong. The auctioneer will guarantee you'll find your pot of gold, but time is a commodity that can't be bought and sold.
Yes. Yeah, I do, but I see in that the effort to feel. I'm trying to find my son. My son is a musician and writes great songs. I'll share some with you, but that's that's a cathartic kind of, that's a meaningful thing, and it's got the combination of both, kind of doing something real with the emotions that you're really feeling, and at the same time, kind of lifting it up and holding, it's kind of worship in a way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I probably won't be redoing the intro anytime soon, because for me to learn how to do those things would take too much of my time away from what I'm already doing.
Yep.
But I have great admiration for the people who know how to clip things and put them together, and have a B-roll on their shows and all of that kind of stuff. We haven't gotten around to Matthew Siegel yet. I wonder if you have time in the future, we can still talk about that.
Yeah, I'm just kind of diving into that whole area, and I'm really, it was your channel that got me over to that, and I'm really trying to figure out the Whitehead, the Whitehead story, and I'm reading his book, and I'm intrigued by it. It's very much in line with, it's a whole little cul-de-sac of thinking that I had not been exposed to before, and so I'm appreciative of your talking to him, and I'm going to try to fool around with that for a while, I think.
Yeah, I would be interested in getting your perspective on it. I've had kind of a love-hate relationship with Whitehead, partly because he's so hard to understand, I think. And
what about the general area of this process theology?
Well, that's the whole thing. I went after that for a while. I really looked into it quite a bit, and part of it made me feel very uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah, because it's very, I don't know what you'd say. It's kind of certainly not down the mainstream of Christian thought.
But then I did a 6-episode series on radical
orthodoxy.
Yeah,
John
Milbank.
Milbank, right? Yeah, I've bumped into that a little bit because I'm a fan of David Bentley Hart, who is kind of in that same. He's adjacent to Milbank.
Yeah. So that helped me to see the idea of process theology through a slightly different lens. And I think the thing that made me most uncomfortable about process theology, the idea that God changes. Because Scripture says that he's the same today, yesterday, and forever. But change does not necessarily have to mean there's many different ways in which we conceptualize change.
Well, it's one of the foundational, not paradoxes, but dualities in the Western tradition, right? Can't stick your foot in the same river twice.
Yes.
So change implies unity, because you can't, if two things are entirely and completely unrelated, then there's no change there. So change is changing of one thing. It's an evolution of one thing. So this is where, so that's the duality there that is
Now,
not
I hadn't heard that before, that change implies unity. That's really interesting.
I mean, if you look at the word that Heraclitus, well, you can't stick your foot in the same river twice. You couldn't even say that if you didn't see one river. Right. So, I think that's one of the things about Heraclitus that people miss, is that he's thought of as the philosopher of flux and all of change, and his element is fire, and people think of him as that, but he really is trying to show that duality, that both sides of that pole. The unity and the change are kind of self-defining. I mean, interdefining of each other.
Well, another way that works with rivers is that when torrential rains change the course of a river by changing, by maybe pummeling the boundary of the river, or opening up a new water course or something like that, there's a sense in which the land has been, not only the river has been changed, but the land has been changed. And so it's their relationship to one another that's continually changing. So you have the rain, you have the boundaries of the river, and you have the river itself. And we've had a number of conversations on my channel about the impassibility of God. But how can how can God be completely impassible if at the same time he takes our sorrows upon himself, and he gives himself for us? He's
a God. He's a God of history. He's a God.
He's somehow being changed by his relationship with us, but not changed in the sense of,
you could say his character doesn't change.
Yes, yeah, you could say his character doesn't change, but he's allowing our impress upon himself. He says, "You are engraved upon the palms of my hands." So my impress is upon him. The impress of my life and of my sin and of everything else is affecting him. So, yeah. So anyway, I don't think that whole thing about process theology, although the way many of them talk about it, I don't like it at all. So
yeah, it's the avenue towards the open theology kind of movement, and I'm not terribly interested in that particular dimension, direction of it.
Yeah,
I think that your guy Siegel, though, is a little different than that. He's more a whitehead guy. He's more, I don't know. Is he expressly a Christian? Do I know that or not? I don't know.
I don't think so, but
yes, he says Jewish.
I don't know. I haven't asked him, but I have not.
He's very articulate. I just like
so intelligent, so articulate. Yeah.
Very articulate. I like that kind of presentation of people who have really kind of honed their ability to talk and organize their thoughts clearly. And, I really appreciate that with him. David Bentley Hart is in a way the same for me that way, even though he's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder and a little attitude sometimes.
This is why I've never explored David Bentley Hart, because the way he talks to people.
Yeah.
For example, the way he talks about Jordan Peterson.
Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. He can be very snide, and he uses his eloquence, and he'll turn it into a rapier, and he can't resist it. He in some of his books, there's like paragraphs that are just very eloquent, high levels of use of language. But if you're noticing what the message is, it's very kind of digging on issues that he's very kind of ready to be kind of snide and sarcastic about. You have to kind of get past that with him.
That'd be hard for me,
yeah,
because
and if
he's
you're not
already
wanting,
hard to understand, and
yeah,
then to
yeah,
invest the time that it would take to get past all that.
yes, that's something about him. You have to be forgiving of that, and then you can get some stuff from him. But so,
well, before you go,
yep,
about this issue of change, I just wanted
yep.
to bring up something that came up in I was reviewing for my conversation with Lucas about Austrian economics. I was reviewing a conversation that I had done with Sevilla and Ira, where each of us represented a book. She represented Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Metaphysics of Quality. I represented Maps of Meaning, and Ira represented Human Action or Austrian economics. And we were talking about a series that Robert Breedlove and Mike Hill had done about the metaphysics of quality, which was just an excellent series. And in there, they had this little graphic with change, action, and value kind of forming this triad that moves in a circle.
Change, action, and
Value.
Okay.
And they were saying that change is the first thing, and then that change precipitates action, and then action builds value. But we were saying value has to come first, because without value, there's no motion that's going to result in change. Jordan Peterson is always saying you have to have some guiding value above you to guide yourself forward through the field of infinite possibility, or you just stand immobilized at the threshold, which I take to be the same thing as having a boundary condition, right? Yeah. So
I think Whitehead has the, kind of tries to, and I'm just really starting into this, but I think that what I'm hearing is that he uses the kind of organic metaphor, which I think can be useful there. Like, if you think about a plant or a rose, you really can't understand it. You're not grasping it. You're not knowing what it is if you're not seeing its entire temporal evolution, from its, beginning to the bud, to the, blossom, etc. You're not really even though you may see it or engage with it at one instant, what you're really seeing there is the entire arc of that change. And it's the change here is not entirely unguided, framed, because it's obviously an organism that's constrained by its own essence, its own temporal path that it's ultimately going to be on through its through what it is. And so you have then again that Heraclitus thing where you have the change, but it's in a unity. It's in a single entity, if you will.
Well, I think the part that I get a little uncomfortable with Whitehead, or with what I hear him say, I haven't read Whitehead.
Yeah,
I've only read
neither,
about
so
him. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I hear people saying is that there's this idea that God is, for lack of a better way of putting it, trying to find himself. The way he finds himself is through creating, and then the evolution of life mirroring back to him who he is, and that in a sense he is evolving into himself. I have a problem with that, because for me, a rose, yes, it starts with a seed and it grows into a rose, but before it starts as a seed, there is a rose. And that rose has the seed, and then that seed grows into a rose. And so that you always start with a hole somewhere, and then that hole is recreated through some process, but you always start with the hole. So to say that God is somehow evolving from particles or whatever, like even a lot of scientists talk about that, where they say,
and I think Whitehead I understand Whitehead the same way you described, and he wants to kind of, rather than save the appearances, he wants to save natural science in a certain sense. He wants to somehow describe the whole show, and not jettison natural science in his elaboration of what he envisions God to be. And that's how, yeah, I think you're right about that.
Well,
don't
I
necessarily
don't think it's necessary
Yeah.
to do that though,
Yeah,
in
I
order
think
to
I
save
agree with
natural
you.
sciences. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that there's a much clearer path, which I think
Yeah.
is through this whole idea of principles rather than rules. So
Mhm.
we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, let's plan on it.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I've really enjoyed getting to know all the people that we've bumped into in this corner, and at Chino, and you in particular. So I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Yeah, Chino was amazing. If we do this again, I hope people show up. I heard that there's going to be another one in Israel in
Ooh,
February, but I don't know
yeah,
if that's true. So,
not possible for me probably, but that would be
yeah,
glorious. That would
yeah,
be a big trip.
for sure.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jim. And
Karen,
we'll
thanks
talk
a
again
lot. I
soon.
appreciate it. Thanks
Okay.
again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.